Got lots of different screens open. Um, First, I want to welcome you all for taking time out of your precious schedules for this rather odd presentation. I myself call it curious. It's fun for me to do this, and I appreciate your taking an interest in it. I think you'll certainly know more about something before we're done, and I think you'll be equally curious about this historical anomaly that I'm going to describe because it always has surprises for me. I'm really happy to be able to do this, and it's actually uh, really good that I'm doing this through Zoom because it's really much easier to do this through Zoom. I made presentations in person for years to all kinds of groups, and it's much easier to sit down at a computer and not have to worry about projectors and stuff like that. I want to thank Shari Shemayim for sponsoring this and publicizing it. It's interesting to note that Rabbi Diamond heard early versions of this research in the early 80s when we were all much younger in a different world. That research culminated in a master's degree, and more importantly, it ignited a love for this little piece of Torah that has lasted many decades. Some of you, maybe many of you, have heard all or some of this over the years at Shabbos lunch or a walk home from shul. Some people have even read chapters of the book that this will all one day become as testers. But people have, sorry, a few people have seen even half of what I have to show you in these presentations. There's quite a bit more research that's keeping that area of my life alive. And so without further ado, I want to move to more interesting things. I'm going to share the screen again and begin the presentation in a moment. Okay, in a moment. There we are. So I've called this the curious history of the inverted nuns because it really is a very curious story. In theory, what I'm going to speak about and demonstrate in these presentations about the evolving shape and location of the markings that you see on the screen should not really be possible. But nevertheless, in front of you on the screen, you see two images of two Sifrei Torah that are from different places and different times. They're separated by maybe 400 years, but they are different. I can point out many, many differences, especially in the issue of the Nuns between these two. You can see the two squiggly things in the left-hand image and the more bracket-like designs on the right-hand side. That's exactly what we're talking about. Um, that's the whole point of this, that over 2,000 years of our history, as most everything has evolved, so did the design and shape and location of these markings. That's what I'm going to speak about for the next couple of hours over the next few weeks. If you have questions or comments to make, please put them in the chat, and I'll get to them later, before 8, and we'll have some time after 8 because I'm not going anywhere. So the next thing I want to show you is what this presentation is not about. It's not about the nun moth, which happens to carry on its back inverted nuns, so to speak, nor is it the inverted nun presented in the right-hand image. And if you go to the internet, there are actually a couple of people who have pictures like that dressed up as nuns in their habits. That's not what we're talking about. I can't tell you how many times I've heard the joke about the inverted nuns, the perverted nuns. I've heard it all. But we are talking about this. You're seeing in front of you a Sefer Torah in our community that has the text of Numbers 10, 35, and 36 surrounded by markings. I'm not going to call them inverted nuns now because I think that's a bit of a misnomer, as you'll see later. The markings surround the text that you see at the bottom of the screen, which we say when we take out the Sefer Torah, Vayihi b'nso ha'aron, and when we put back the Sefer Torah, we say Uvnu Chayomar. That's all pretty standard. The 85 letters between the markings are really not much of a concern to me, and you'll find out why. I am studying an idea here and its expression through time. The idea is that there are markings around this text, and they've been there for a very, very long time. The history is the appearance and adoption of new designs, different locations, and new and innovative interpretations for the markings. Every generation literally made its mark on the history of this tradition. This is a study of the relevant literature, traditional Jewish sources, and graphical evidence from scrolls, codices, and printed books. It's focused on this one really picayune, unique phenomena, 2,000 plus years of a rabbinic analysis of even such a minute phenomena produces a significant amount of information that I've been accumulating and commenting on for 40 years. There's a little bit of Midrash, there's a little bit of Talmud, a little bit of Bible, a little bit of everything else that is in our tradition, and there is lots of images, and I'm letting people in as we go. And so this study would fall into a category of Jewish studies known as Masoretic studies. There'll be more about that in a moment. It's the study of the text of the Hebrew Bible. Now, that there is a history to the text of the Hebrew Bible is a question in some people's minds, but I'll deal with that in a moment. This is an unfinished tale. It's a tale which I was told by quite a few in those days, that it could not be told, that the Torah has not changed, they said, and there's certainly not evidence to be had for what I'm trying to show. It's letter perfect by tradition. Scribes never changed a thing. But the books always told a different tale. That led to 40 years of discovering, reading, and probing our tradition for clues, evidence, statements about these markings. The internet and the pandemic were very, very good for my research. My search for evidence has never been fruitless. Everywhere I've looked, I have found some tidbit that's incorporated somewhere in my work. This goes far beyond presenting or comparing traditional overviews of the comments of several Bible commentaries. There is so much parshanut incorporated in the larger work, but I only bring it in where it's relevant to the history of the markings, their design, and position. The presentations I'm making are going to quickly establish the fundamentals about the markings from rabbinic texts. There's about 1,000 years of material of rabbinic texts, and then I'll present and discuss images to the latter 1,000 years of the history of the text. I'm trying to let some more people in. There's far more than I can present in 2 sessions, and the research goes on. This presentation actually has relevant materials that I've only uncovered in recent weeks. Please understand, my goal has never been to determine the theological message entailed in the bigger text or in the markings. My goal was to document the evolution of this scribal phenomena and the accompanying discussion about the design and position of the markings. So, here we go. There is such a thing as the history of the Bible text. It's been in our hands since we got the text at Sinai. That means mistakes, errors, and traditions are bound to occur and accrue to the text and its accompanying traditions. Our Torah is preserved incredibly well over thousands of years, but our literature shows that there were always issues being discussed and fixes were made. This science of literature is not much studied today, as there's been so little need to focus on the Masoretic text, the words and letters, over the last few hundred years because of printing houses and editors. Since 1949, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, there's been an explosion of work in the area of the history of the text. Unbelievable amounts of work done in 50 years. All the sources and references that I'm going to bring are bona fide Jewish sources. They can be found in good libraries, and the vast majority are available online, including the images you're going to see. All of it is online. All of the opinion, and this is a really important point for everyone to remember, all of the important opinions about this topic that I'm going to show you were expressed by practicing what we call today frum Jews, the most learned rabbis and scribes. Their goal always was produce the best text possible. The text which Hashem gave to us on Sinai was the goal for perfection. When I speak about changes made to the Torah regarding the Nuns, I'm not referencing or presenting a theory of modern Bible scholarship. I'm reading traditional texts which tell a curious tale of changes made to the markings around this text, and they constitute an evolution of this text. All of the changes and modifications to text which I show were surely made with the approval of local rabbis and scholars, just as the following things I'm going to mention were. We already know about history of the text subtopics like Kri and Ktiv, different spellings of words that you see in your everyday Chumash and Shul on Shabbat. There's the story of 3 scrolls which were in the temple, and each one of them had a mistake that got corrected, but based on the other 2. We know about Tikkun Sofrim, where rabbis changed for editorial purposes, seemed to have changed for editorial purposes, words and phrases in the Torah. There's the Nun of Haran, which Rashi says is upside down, and no Sefer Torah that you and I have ever seen has that Nun turned upside down. There's much written about all of this. There's all of the larger and smaller and oddly shaped letters in the Sefer Torah. There are dotted Bible texts in 10 places in the Sefer Torah that have an interesting piece to say about the history of the text. There's all of the other texts that parallel our texts from the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's the differences between the Talmud versions of verses and the Tanakh version of verses, where they don't agree with each other over thousands of years. And of course, there's what is called the inverted Nuns. All of these are little pieces of the history of the text of the Hebrew Bible that have been accumulating over many, many years. We've all wrapped it up now in a package, and we see a very broad history. I've mentioned the Masorah a couple of times. You're probably familiar with the Masorah notation system, which started around 500, near the close of the Talmudic era, where Chazal, our scholars, realized that in order to preserve the pristine text of the Torah, they needed to record all the oddities and anomalies and differences between words that appeared here and there. So these notes in between the columns and at the top and bottom of the page are really a very interesting insight into the history of the text, because they preserve a record of what they saw in their texts based on an accounting of spelling anomalies. There's a whole science to that. It's a huge area of research today, but it gives us insight into this tradition. It ends up with what we now call the Masoretic text. That is the official text of the Hebrew Bible. Now, when you go to look for a Tanakh, you generally don't have to ask for a particular version of the words and letters that are in there, but you can buy different versions of the Holy Scriptures based on different manuscripts. The kosher one for us is called the Masoretic text, because the Masoretes were the scholars who made up the notation and kept the text within a system of perfection. Our story starts way, way back in the Mishnah with some explicit text. The rest The next few slides are all rabbinic texts that give us the foundation pillars of this whole story. The Mishnah, I'm not going to read the Hebrew text. You can do that on your own, or I can provide you with the sources. For ease of presentation and comprehension, I'm going to do most of this in English. So the Mishnah says that the 85 letters of this text defile the hands. That's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. Defiles the hands in the Mishnah means it's a holy text because it transfers tuma, impurity, to the hands. I'm not going to get into the whole issue of why and what, but the Mishnah says this is a very special text because even though it's 85 letters long, if it's divorced from the Sefer Torah, it is still holy. There's an inherent holiness. The reason for that, I'll speak of in a moment. But the earliest text we have, the earliest text of Jewish law, the earliest recorded literature of our people, besides the Torah, says something very special about this text. The Gemara continues and tells us that God himself made these markings, they're called signs, simniot, in the Torah, above and below this text, to tell us that this is not its place. That means that Chazal had an idea that this text was transposed. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, no slouch, he himself says that it's marked because it's considered an independent book. That rolls over in the Gemara's discussion to Rabbi Yonatan's opinion that there are 7 books in the Sefer Torah, Bereshit, Shmot, Vayikra, Bamidbar divided into 3 books up until 1035, and the 5th book would be Numbers 10:35 and 36. The 6th book is the last part of Numbers after 11:1, and the 7th book is Devarim. So there's this notion in the ancient world that it's not 5 books, it's 7 books, or it's 5 books divided up into 7 parts, but it's not one uniform 5 books in the Sefer Torah. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel said something extremely controversial at the bottom here. He says it's marked because in the future, this text will be uprooted from here and put in its proper place, which is to say, if we stay alive long enough, you will see another edition of the Sefer Torah, which is a very radical statement, but it's here from Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. So the Gemara is quite explicit that there are 4 theories. It's either a misplaced text, and that's why it's marked. It's an independent text, and that's why it's marked. We'll talk about being an independent text in a minute. It delineates a section that's got to be moved somewhere to another place. There was a scribal problem, and our version needs a fix. And it was put here to interrupt the context of the story, meaning it came from somewhere else. Why did it land here? Because God didn't want to give the Torah with 2 stories of calamities in a row. There are 2 stories where Bnei Yisrael get punished, and seemingly this text is inserted in there to make it more literarily, to be more literarily sensitive to us. So there are 4 rabbinic theories here. The most interesting one is that it's an independent text and it's marked. Because the notion that there are 7 books here means that there was something going on that we don't understand, and something very special happened to this text that necessitated it being marked so the scribe would note that. As an aside, what I think happened was this text was incorporated into our Torah because it was thought to be holy. It happened to have got put in the wrong place, and the markings were to tell the Sofer, who next copied the Torah, that it should be put in its proper place. I'll be able to show that more clearly later. I want to go backwards in time now a few hundred years to show you the precursors of this phenomena. These signs, the sigma and anti-sigma, which look different down in the text that I stole here from Google. A C and a backward C, dotted or not dotted, were used in ancient Hellenistic scribal schools to mark a text that was in an incorrect position. When you're copying scrolls, it's really easy. Your eye strays, you put the pen down in the wrong place, your eye follows the word, and you end up transposing a text. You can imagine in last week's Parsha in Shul, there were so many repetitious paragraphs, it would be easy to get the wrong details in a paragraph that looked like the one that you hadn't written yet. That's what these markings are there to show. There's a problem in this text, it's out of place, it's out of line, it needs to go somewhere else. And these markings were used in ancient texts like this. Here you see a 10th century copy of Homer. And the markings I'm speaking about from the Hellenic world are right there and there, but top left and bottom right, surrounding the text that is problematic. This is a classic Hellenistic editorial or diacritical mark that seems to have been incorporated into our Torah by Chazal because it's there for this exact purpose. They are an editorial sign indicating that the line so marked is at an incorrect position, exactly what the Gemara says is going on here. This is a picture of the oldest copy of Sefer Vayikra from the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's old enough to be in Paleo-Hebrew. Our tradition says that Ezra in the 5th century BC changed us into the script we're familiar with. This copy of Vayikra is, at least script-wise, very, very old. And in it, lo and behold, is a transposed text, meaning a piece of Vayikra that we know about is in the wrong place, and it ends exactly here where the arrow is, and that arrow is pointing to this circular anti-sigma shaped mark with a dot in it. The purpose of this is exactly what Chazal said, she'ein ze mekoma. This is not its place. So all this is just evidence that Chazal knew what the Greeks did when a text was misplaced by a scribe. They say that clearly in our literature, and there is the earliest, what I call the earliest inverted nun that anyone's ever seen. Sifrei Bamidbar is a standard rabbinic midrash on Sefer Bamidbar, and it says that there are signs before and after this text because this is not its place. That's my translation. Many people would say that nakud alav milmala umilmata means it's dotted before and after because this was not its place. It's true that nakud means dotted. It's true that there are dotted words in the Chumash and Tanakh, but it's clear to me at least that this really isn't dotted. It means it was marked, because that makes much more sense given Chazal's understanding of what's going on here. So that's my understanding. Nakud means marked. It makes it a lot easier to figure this out. But the dotted tradition, as I show you here in pictures that I promised, continues for many hundreds of years. The bottom right image of inverted nuns with dots is from the 15th century. But the earliest copies of the Tanakh that are official and corrected are up here on the top left. The London Codex, the Washington Bible, the Leningrad Codex, all seem to have a dotted character. The 14th century Bible, the 13th century Bible on the bottom row are also dotted. This 11th century document at the top right, which I'll speak more about in a minute, is also dotted. Clearly, dotted markings were a thing for a very long time, and then they disappear. You'll see that yourselves soon. So here's a range of designs as well. Notice how different these designs are from each other and from what you see in the Sefer Torah today. That's part of the evolution, how and why. Now, granted, many of these look the same as each other, but they all have subtle differences that contribute to the history of this. Masechet Sofrim is the next document, a standard rabbinic work. It's actually sort of an addendum, minor tractate to the Babylonian Talmud in every Jewish library. And it says that a scribe must provide a space for the section beginning Vayihi Binso Ha'aron, because it's an independent book. That's what was said earlier in the Talmud. It's a book unto itself. It's one of 7. Now, obviously this tradition is continuing. I'm going to focus in on what the scribe is said to be required to do. He must provide a space for the section beginning. Now, upon first reading of that 40 years ago, I said, oh, that makes perfect sense. This is a new book of the Bible, so just like before Sefer Vayikra, there's a space of a few lines, or between sections, paragraphs of the text, there's space. This new book needs to have a space before Vayihi Binso Ha'aron because it's an independent book. But further research into the footnotes and the scientific apparatus of this Masechet Sofrim showed me that it was not clear that the word was a space at the beginning of Vayihi Binso Ha'aron, because one of the texts says shipur, which is, by dictionary definition, something trumpet-shaped, like shofar. And lo and behold, there's a third manuscript that says that he has to make a shofar, which is what Chazal would call something that was crescent-shaped. It's easily recognizable. It's a shofar shape. So now you have a Talmudic text, Talmudic-era text, telling us that there's got to be something round-ish, like a sigma, an anti-sigma, in front of Vayihi Binso Ha'aron. But you still have texts like Midrash Mishlei, another rabbinic text, which tells us that whether it's above or below, this text is dotted. Again, nakud. Or is it marked? So there's equal amounts of evidence for all of this. We've seen dotted texts. We've seen texts that don't have a dot. They have another marking. The plot thickens. We're only at about the 8th century now. Now, here's another quote continuing from Midrash Mishlei. Rebbe says, Sefer Haya Bifnei Atzmo, this was an independent text, v'nignaz. And there's scholarly and rabbinic discussion about what that means. The two sides are clearly at opposite ends of the spectrum. One side says v'nignaz means this was an independent book and it was taken out of circulation. The nefarious story would be it was too hot to handle and they had to put it in a cave somewhere to get it away from people. I think that means it just got worn out and was put away, as would happen with any book. That's what the Cairo Geniz is all about. But the other scholarly opinion says that this means that this was an independent text and it needs to be properly archived when it's not in use, in condition for use. Meaning it's holy enough, it's got a provenance that says it's kosher and 100%, and it, if you find it by itself, needs to be archived properly. That's a whole important piece here. I want to take you back to the Mishnah, where the Mishnah said that this text was special and it was defiling the hands. Ultimately, that means, and I'm painting a picture here of how this happened. I think what happened is there was once an 85-letter scrap of parchment scroll hanging around the writing room somewhere in Qumran. I don't know where this was. It was from a holy scroll, but it was animal chewed, burned, torn beyond use, worn out, except that there were these 85 letters. So the question came up, is this short text, this independent text, kosher, holy, worthy of preserving, or can I put it in the trash or use it for another scroll? And the answer came back 85 letters, like Vayihi bin Soa Ha'aron and Sefer Bamidbar, is the minimum, the paradigm for the smallest number of letters that keep a scroll kosher. I think that led to that text being preserved in a scroll. What better way to preserve it than to write it into a scroll? Remember, the book called Treyasar 12 is one scroll of 12 books. So there's a model for that happening. And you end up with this text being preserved but marked as special because it has a special provenance. That's what I think the science behind this is. Pieces of it are provable, pieces out of it are conjecture, but the Nignaz proves the point that they considered this text very special and what we call holy. And now a very interesting aside. There's this rather esoteric but published midrash called Chaserot V'Yeterot, which means letters that are missing and letters that are added. And it's a Masoretic work of anomalies in the text. And it says that there are two verses in the Sefer Torah where there are inverted nuns, which are from the prophecies of Eldad and Medad. And some say that the inverted nuns teach that there was a withdrawn book, Sefer Ganuz. So the withdrawn book is the text we just read before, that it was Sefer Bifnei Atzmo V'Nignaz. But this text says that the two verses came from a book called The Prophecies of Eldad and Medad. That's one of 24 books that the Tanakh mentions that we don't have. But the point is that it provides an answer to the question, where did this independent text come from? It was an obvious question that Chazal had to ask at some point. It's recorded here in Chaserot V'Yeterot, and it has a very interesting answer. It came from the text of Eldad and Medad, the prophecies of Eldad and Medad, because the Torah tells us there was a book in which the events of Eldad and Medad, who were prophesying outside the camp when the elders had gone elsewhere, the Torah says there, V'hema ba'ketuvim. In the middle of this verse that tells us that the Spirit rested upon them and they were prophesying, it says, they are in the annals. My translation, but it means literally, they are in the written texts. That's why Chazal say that there was a book called the Sefer of Eldad and Medad, and it's the source of these 85 letters. Fascinating aside, there's much more to say about that, but it's part of the history here. Here comes Hai Gaon at the end of the Gaonic period around the 11th century. He's really the most famous Gaon. He's responsible for a huge watershed in Jewish law and history. And he gives us some more information about the markings in his day. They are, and he's not talking about, the Gemara where he makes this gloss is talking about writing symbols on Shabbos that aren't letters. And he says those would be letters not known in a script because they're called symbols in the space, like the inverted nuns, which are written at Vayihi bin Soa Ha'aron. And he says, symbols in the spaces, simanim be'alma, and he calls them nunin hafuchin, and we're going to get to that in a minute. This is a huge change in the whole position here. They're described. The markings have now been described as something other than dots, and they are in the spaces. Very important that Hai said that. Just a break here. All my sources come from these places, and almost everything I have in what is a huge amount of literature and images are all public domain. You can go find any of these images that I'm going to show you in these places. The Vatican was a vast storehouse of information. The Jewish National Library in Israel, Robarts has an amazing collection. The Hebrew U has a database of all the manuscripts of everything. So all of this stuff is readily available. It just has to be sought after, and that becomes part of the hunt. For images, I was looking for copies of Sifrei Torah or codices. Those are parchment books that exist in university and collected libraries all over the planet. Librarians were very willing to help me. Scholars have been very willing to help me with things I couldn't readily find. But all of this stuff is no secret. I want to say a point here that may bother a lot of people. It bothers me a lot. A good portion of this work is deciding to ignore the bad calligraphy that might be the source of the evolution of the markings. Changes in the script of markings in Sifrei Torah might be because scribes were not good artists, and they certainly weren't practiced at making markings outside of the letters of the Hebrew alphabet that go in a Sefer Torah. Other than those letters, these are the only other real markings in the Sefer Torah. So here's a great example to start us off. This is the famous Aleppo Codex. This is the Bible that Maimonides himself said was perfect, Masoretically, textually, vocalization was perfect. This is the paradigm. We don't have it all anymore. Some of it disappeared just before the state was created. But we don't have the inverted nuns from Numbers. We have them from Psalm 107. You can look this up in your own Tanakh. They will be there. There are 7 inverted nuns almost in a row. They're up and down here, top part of the page. It's not at all clear why they're there. There's very, very, very little, almost nothing written about these in the literature. But I want to show you the bad calligraphy here. If you walk your eye down each of these nuns, I admit they all look marginally the same, but just look at these top two. Yes, they're dotted. There's a huge difference in the crown shape of the two of these. Go to the third one, and it morphs again into something else that's recognizable as an inverted nun, but it's not the same as the second one, nor is it the same as the third one. The bottom one is really very different. It's got this crook in it. So it looks like the scribe is trying to go back left after he's been right. I believe that this is careless, this is poor practice, but it's problematic because of what you're going to see as we move forward. Remember, bad calligraphy. Here are some manuscripts that you've seen before and some new ones. I want to point out that early on, this is the 11th century, maybe earlier. All of these things took very long to write and vocalize, so it's likely that we're seeing traditions that are already hundreds of years old in these manuscripts. Notice how these first two, Michigan and Damascus, are very similar to each other, while London and Leningrad are similar to each other, but a very different marking. That's significant for the evolution here. This is early textual evidence of the difference or the watershed in directions these markings are taking. This is the piece that made me fall in love with this study. This is a rarely known text called Ginzei Mitzrayim. It appeared at the same time as the Dead Sea Scroll, as the Cairo Geniza materials started coming out at the beginning of the 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century. And it is an introduction to the Bible. If you were to go buy an introduction to the Bible today, it would cover many of the topics that this document from the 11th or 10th century covers. It's written in prose, it's beautiful Hebrew, it's relatively easy to read. And it was the first manuscript that replaced a transcribed published text that I discovered. I probably had to write away to the seminary in New York to get this because some things aren't quite online yet. But it showed me these images of the markings. So this text around here is explaining what they mean. We'll get to that in a second for a minute. But it provides a diagram from someone who was writing, hopefully, an accurate introduction to the Bible as to what these markings looked like in his community. And we know from here that we see the markings in those various manuscripts that look very much like this. Notice that they're dotted. So Ginzei Mitzrayim says, I'm reading here in the second line in the middle, that God inverted these markings to reflect the position, to reflect an attitude that God had uprooted, turned over, turned backwards and upside down the anguish of the journey that the people were on in the desert, so that they wouldn't become frustrated by it. Shelo yitzta'aruba. And then the manuscript, the printed manuscript, has these markings drawn like this. It always bothered me that they were so straight and clean, but for decades I had to work with them as that. I knew they were there. I had to make sense of the text that these were embedded in. The text continues. Like those things who go down to the sea in boats do their work. And I added in with to make sense of that. These markings are like the things that they who go down to the sea and in boats do their work with. And you can quite easily see that in the Hebrew, ki yotzei bo yordei hayam be'oniot osot melacha. So I think that that's what that means. And then it dawned on me that there's something else going on here. Yordei hayam be'oniot osei melacha b'mayim rabim is the pasuk in Psalms 107 that has the first inverted nun. So the author of Ginzei Mitzrayim is telling us that the markings that are in the Sefer Torah look like things that people who go down to the mighty waters to do their work, to ply their trade, use. It took me a very long time to figure out what that was referring to, and it finally dawned on me that we're talking about fish hooks. And the author of Ginzei Mitzrayim is saying, these things look like fish hooks. Number 5 is a particularly good example. If you look at number 4 up here, they've even got the dots on top. I'm not saying this is the fish hook that the guy had in mind, but these are medieval fish hooks from approximately the time of Ginzei Mitzrayim, and he uses them to describe what these markings should look like. And they do look like fish hooks. As you can see in the top right, there's a fish hookness to these. This little discovery here was enough to make me say, if I can keep doing this kind of research and finding this kind of neat stuff over and over again, I could spend my whole life doing this. The kicker was that the word nun in Aramaic means fish. So this is a perfect circle of rabbinic interpretation using an illustration found in the Chumash. No one ever told you before there were illustrations in the Chumash. This is just one of them. We're going to get to another one soon. So here you have an 11th century Geniza document with pictures of fish hooks telling us why the Sefer Torah looks like that. Of course, we have to get to Rashi. Rashi is another major player in this. He says, quoting the Gemara, that God made marks in front and behind this text in order to indicate this is not its proper place. We've heard that already. Rashi quotes the Gemara all the time. No big deal. Why was it written here? Again, he quotes the Gemara to distinguish between two tales of punishment or calamity, and we've heard that before. So Rashi brings in a scientific remark at the beginning. They're there because it's not its place, they're editorial marks. And then he provides a literary interpretation that says they were put here these verses were put here specifically to cause you less emotional difficulty when you're reading these two stories. A very interesting comment, which to my mind always meant Rashi was really sort of chickening out here about telling us what these really were. There's a whole chapter in my book about that, but there's more to this. Rashi also commented on the inverted nuns where they appear in the Gemara text in Shabbos. And he says there they are to differentiate it from adjacent text. We already heard him say that. They're at the beginning and end of Vayhi bin Sawah Ha'aron. That becomes a critical piece in the history here because you can't be clearer about what Rashi says the location of the markings is. They're Batchila Uvasof, the beginning and the end. I can't imagine how anyone could interpret that differently, but just wait. And he also says this in Rosh Hashanah, where they're talking about, again, Sabbath violations, about in writing marks. He says the marks you're not allowed to make are things like the simaniot, the symbols, which are, Rashi says, bein pasuk lepasuk, between the verses, there are simanim, symbols, hafuchin. We'll get to what that means in a minute. And, by the way, the text says that Rashi text says there's a drawing there of these markings. I've never seen a manuscript for that, but I'm still looking. So the point here is that he says they are hafuchin. Well, we all think that means inverted, but how do you know it doesn't mean reversed, meaning backwards, facing backwards? There's no way to know whether Rashi means inverted or reversed. He could mean that's backwards. He could mean it's upside down. Hafuch has no definition. So when you say it's a siman hafuch, what siman are you looking for? That siman isn't the name of a character that's definable as anything but not a letter. Any scribble is a siman. So Rashi's not really left us with a whole lot more information than we didn't already know, but he's very influential, obviously. Rashi is Rashi. So there's four things Rashi says. They indicate that it's out of whack. There's been a transposition, separating tales of calamity and punishment. They're before and after the text of Numbers 10, 35, and 36. And they are reversed, or I'm going to call them reversed symbols here for a while, simanin hafuchin. So we continue a little bit to analyze these inverted and reversed so you can recognize them. Here you see a symbol inverted. All that is a nun flipped upside down, top to bottom. Below, it's reversed, back to normal, and then flipped laterally so that it's facing backwards. There's also, you're going to see an inverted and reversed symbol, which looks like that. So you've got all four possible combinations, permutations of the orientation of this to recognize and deal with. So there's 1,000 years of interest in this that we've quickly gone through. What's the purpose of these markings? We have good questions. We have some answers. What do they look like? Maybe they're dots. Maybe there's something else. It's not clear. Where are they? Rashi was unequivocal about them being before Vayhi bin Sawah Ha'aron and after Alfei Yisrael at the end of the 85 letters. And what do they mean? Because there always has to be meaning for everything in the Torah. That's where I leave you tonight so that we can have a few minutes of questions and discussion, and I can tantalize you with another hour of this in a few weeks. So I'm going to stop the screen share and go back to my screen and see your faces and nothing in the chat. So I'm opening it up to questions and comments. Questions, comments? Someone's got to have a hand up. Nope, nothing?
Sholom was fascinating. Fascinating stuff. That's what I will say. That's my comment.
I've set you up for all the pictures because you're going to understand the pictures now. You'll see. Questions?
Sholom.
Yeah. Who's speaking?
Morris.
Morris.
For some
Hello.
reason, I can't see my face anymore. It says I'm recording something, but I don't want to be recording. Anyway, the question is, are there any other kinds of inversions like this? A chaf, any other inversion?
Yes. I mentioned there's the inverted nun in Haran, which we can see historically, but doesn't appear in any scrolls today, kosher scrolls at least that I know of. There are several inverted in letters here and there throughout history. They come and they go. Nothing that is as significant and as well recorded and documented as these inverted nuns, these inverted markings. They're not necessarily nuns, that they look like nuns.
Okay. One other comment, when you showed those Greek C's, they look like the beginning of parentheses, which is how we tend to use parentheses.
Oh, absolutely. A lot of people look at the inverted nuns cold and say, oh, they're brackets. Exactly. Brackets could come from the exact same place. Brackets mark out a text about which there's something special to note. That's easy. Yeah, for sure.
Hello?
Yep.
Question. Have you checked, I mean, is the Cairo Geniza accessible? Can you actually go through all the, I know that Dove, what's his name, Dove Friedberg is actually computerizing everything that's found there. So have you had a chance to go through it all? Is it possible you'll come across something that will be really revealing?
I have several images from the Cairo Geniza, radically different from each other, that are ready to show you in 2 weeks. The Cairo Geniza is really easy to search through. I found two things of interest from a beginner's search. There's some more work to be done, but I think I obviously don't know what I didn't discover, but I've got representation from the Cairo Geniza. I have representation of markings from, I believe, every century since, depending on what the Aleppo Codex represents, the 9th century. Every single century has something new or innovative or interesting to look at vis-a-vis the markings.
This is worthy of a book.
It's in process.
Well done.
Right. One other question?
Sure.
Just out of curiosity, why the nun?
Yeah, why do you know?
Well, it's not a nun.
Right.
It's a sigma. It looks like a nun. By the time Chazal commented, my theory, by the time Chazal commented on this in the Talmudic period, they had already lost the knowledge of where it came from. They didn't lose what it meant. They said it marks a text that needs to be in a different place. There's some other things it could mean too that are relevant, but it marks a transposed text. They didn't know that it came from the Greek world. They just knew that it was in the Sefer Torah. So it's slavish copying, and they call it a nun because it looks like a nun, whether it's a nun shape at least, whether it's reversed or not. And remember, in Midrash Mishlei, it said that it was a space, a shofar-shaped object, or a shofar-shaped object, which sort of seals the deal about it being round-ish. And there are three letters that they could use to describe a roundish character. It could be the nun, it could be the resh, or it could be the chaf, and that's part of the story later, which I won't get into much. But they somehow, eventually, very soon in our story, they become known as nunin, hafuchin, and almost nothing else, because of the nun shape that went from this to this. So it's not really a nun, we just call it that. David,
okay.
Tom?
Thank you.
What about the Digalim? What do you think about that it belongs with the Parshat of Digalim?
A stab in the dark because conceptually or contextually it would fit there. Maybe that's the place where it was transposed from, but they didn't leave a mark there. I never did the count, but there is a medieval who says that it was a nun because the parsha of the 85 letters should be moved 50 parashot back, 50 pieces of text back, which might be around the story of the Degalim, as Chazal say, but no one ever said it really works out like that. Thus, the parshiot would be different in any Sefer Torah anyway.
Fantastic.
So the presentation in 2 weeks is mostly images. I have to say that behind all of this, from the years 1200 through now I'm working in the 17th century, there's a vast halachic literature that includes parshanut and symbolism. I'll tell you about the Zohar, which took me literally 40 years to figure out, but now I understand much more about why what happened to this tradition happened. It's a fascinating story, the Zohar. And then the whole thing breaks open to there to where pretty much any permutation and combination of marking and position and shape can be found in the documentary evidence. If you want to scribble what you might want to do to which nun of the 85 letters, I can probably pull out a text of the Torah that looked like that at one point. And that's part of the story here, why and how and who and what. And I leave that for 2 weeks from now. So to start off this evening, I first want to dedicate tonight's presentation to the memory of Rav David Weiss-Halivni, who passed away today in Jerusalem. It was particularly poignant to hear this news this morning. I first met Rabbi Halivni at Camp Ramah, Canada, and it was my great zechut, a lifetime of honor, to sit with him 3 times a day, I believe, and have meals with him because we were both sitting at the Hanhalah table. I was the program director, he was the professor in residence. I think his son might have been in camp, certainly had been. And it was there that I was able to soak in the light of his scholarship and erudition. He was a very kind and gentle scholar. He was patient and sensitive to anyone who came to him. He played with campers, he taught the staff. He was really a jack of all trades. I've read many and many of his books and articles since then, but I had no idea who he was and what a giant he was in those days. I now know what a zechut it was to be in the presence of this giant of Torah, and I hope that his memory and the memory many of his students have of him will be a blessing for all of us and for his family.
Amen.
Technical things. Please put questions and comments into the chat, and I'll make every effort to get through them around 8 o'clock. So to begin and recap a little bit, this presentation is about a study of the inverted nun phenomena from relevant literature, traditional Jewish sources, and graphical evidence from scrolls, codices, printed books over some millennia. There's 2,000 years plus of rabbinic analysis of this seemingly minute scribal anomaly, and it has produced a significant amount of literature. This is an exposition of the evolution of the markings at Numbers 10, 35, and 36 in our Sefer Torah, as reflected in artifacts, responsa, and interpretive texts. My goal has never been theological. This is not a Dvar Torah. My goal was to document the evolution of this scribal phenomena, as well as the accompanying discussion about the design and position of the markings at this place in the Torah. All the text sources are from approved sources available in good Jewish libraries and on the internet. All the changes to the Sefer Torah, which will be displayed, were made with rabbinic approval, often by the greatest scholars of the day. These changes were all intended by scribes and scholars to improve the quality of the document or scroll they were looking at. There's much more background to all of this in part one. If you missed it, it's available on the Shar Shemaim YouTube channel. So to recap, our text is first mentioned outside the Torah in the Mishnah as a text that is the minimal length for a text to be considered holy. There are brackets, something that are called simaniot, or signs, which obviously are very ancient because they're in the Torah, and they're probably modeled after what we learned last week are called Greek lunate sigma characters. There'll be some examples of those later, which are found surrounding transposed Greek texts. Scribes put them in to say they made a mistake. From the Talmud, we learned a few things about our tradition about these markings. One is that they mark out the fourth of the 7 books of the Torah, that they are shofar-shaped markings, and they denote this text as one which was transposed and will be placed in its proper place at some future date. It was placed here when it was found needing to be preserved in order to, according to the tradition, in order to interrupt the flow of the story, where several bad stories were separated by these 85 letters. Sometimes the markings are called dots because Sifrei says that this text is nakud alav, which I think means marked above and not dotted. Rashi says that the markings have to be before and Numbers 10, 35, and 36, before Vayihi B'Tzoa Haron and after, and that the markings are hafuchin, and this becomes a major subject. The markings are hafuchin, which can mean either reversed or inverted. So to recap with some of the images we saw, this is the inverted nun lunate sigma character from a proto-Hebrew Leviticus scroll. This is a Dead Sea Scroll, and this is written in the old script, not our contemporary square script. And this is an example of how this was used in an Alexandrian scribal academy. These are the actual dictionary definitions of the Greek diacritical marks that we see as the origin of the inverted nuns. This also can be looked up online. Of course, it said they were dotted, so some people took that literally, and here are examples from the 10th to the 15th century, at least, of inverted nun markings which are dotted. They die out in the Middle Ages. And here, of course, is Maimonides, the Rambam's officially perfect text of the Tanakh with vocalization. We don't have the Bamidbar text that we're looking at mostly, but we have a series of 7 inverted nuns here from Psalm 107, and you'll see that there's a basic shape to these. Remember that because it comes in handy later. Notice they're not identical. Notice that there's a Z shape developing. This might be bad calligraphy or it might be tradition. And we move on from here. There were 1,000 years of questions that we already posed. What is their purpose? What is their design? What is their location? And what is their symbolism? These questions are constantly being asked every year when we read Parshat Beha'alotcha. I was told that I didn't make a point of why they used a nun. So the answer is all over the map. One idea is that the nun stands for nakud, dotted or marked. Maybe that was a scribal mnemonic, that the scribe would see the nun, knowing that's a nakud. I don't believe that. I think that's a silly explanation. The shape of the nun is closest to a Hebrew letter, which could be used to describe the shape after Chazal lost the understanding of what the lunate sigma meant. They thought it looked like a nun, so they said it was a nun shape. They didn't know about sigmas by then. The other thing is that the other possibility of describing it is a chaf shape, which we'll get to in a minute, but nobody ever did that. Nun equals 50 in Gematria, and there's a prominent theory that the proper place for this text of 85 letters is 50 sections earlier in Sefer Bamidbar. No one ever actually points to a specific pasuk or counts 50 the same way, but that's one of the ideas about there being a nun for the markings. Then there is the nun equal to the Shechina. We'll mention this in a few minutes again, but that is an idea that's very prominent. I don't think that's where the nun marking comes from. I think it comes from Hellenistic scribal schools. This is the most likely source. Now, we'll go back to what Rashi says because it's really important as a watershed. He said that the markings indicate that this is not the proper place for this text. That's a Talmudic idea. It was placed here to separate the stories of calamity. That's a midrashic idea that he incorporates. He tells us that the markings are clearly before and after. Milmala umilmata. And he says they're reversed. But does he mean inverted or does he mean reversed? We talked about this last week a bit. You see on the right, there are 4 different possibilities for reversed and inverted, and we will see all of these. It's no great bracha that Rashi said they were inverted or hafuchin, because he doesn't really explain what that means, and that leads to tremendous confusion. And the first thing I want to throw at you is this total complete anomaly from the most famous book, other than Rashi's commentaries, to come out of this period of time. This is from Machzor Vitri, which is literally a handbook of how to do Jewish from the Franco-German school, a generation or two after Rashi. And in it, it's a compendium of how to do stuff, including write the inverted nuns. And you'll notice that on the right-hand side there, the artist who did this, the scribe who did this, gave us a facsimile of what he thought they should look like. And it's the complete opposite of what we would expect from what we've looked at for about 1,000 years of Jewish literature. Here they actually use the chaf as the facsimile for the nun in this text. And this is completely unique. And even though this text has been around since the 11th century and we've known about it since the 12th in third-party references, nobody in all of the research I've done ever mentions this scribal anomaly. Well, there's more. This is something I ran into last winter that is completely unique. There's no references to this in the literature. This is a Persian document of the 11th century. This is old. This is pre-Maimonides. And you'll notice that in the text here, down at the bottom left, this is not a Sefer Torah. It's a rabbinic Bible with an a Judeo-Arabic translation. You'll notice there is this seal, which I've expanded up here, enlarged up here, and it says that these are segregated nunot. It's the only time in all my research where they're referred to as nunot rather than nunim. And it says that we write 2 of them and they're oriented backwards. Took a while to figure out what the code written around this fleur-de-lis like flowery thing is, but it's the Masoretic note that there are supposed to be inverted nuns at this place. And you'll see down at the bottom of the text, there is a sample of what that inverted nun is to look like with a bit of a crown on it, which matches these other markings to the left and right, and the theme of that seal. So that is how this Masoretic author, or the person editing this text, chose to tell the community using this text that there was supposed to be an inverted nun here. Lo and behold, while I was looking at this, and very proud that I had discovered something I'd never seen, my wife came through and looked at this because I was so excited about it, and she said, "Look, there's another one that's been erased at the top." And she's right. If you look right at the top, where just about where this circle is, to the left of the circle should move, and there's an enlargement of it on the right-hand side here, and you can see the beginnings of, or what's left of an erasure of the same kind of inverted nun with the flowery crown on top that should appear, that does appear, except for its erasure, here on top. I would not think that this is erased from overuse, because the rest of the text is very clear and pristine. I think someone actually took this out of here, and you'll see that's not impossible given the rest of the history. Here is the relevant piece of the earliest and best copy of Rashi's commentary on the Torah. It appears around this text, but I brought this to show you that in the early 13th century, that's about 100 years after Rashi died, less than 100 years, there are very special markings in this text, which comes from somewhere Franco-Germany. You'll notice that there are two markings here on the left, and they're radically different. And in the early 13th century, someone in this very important codex included a Z-shaped marking, and both the Z-shaped and the standard reversed backwards nun both have dot markings on top. I would think the dot markings are more Masoretic notes than dots on the markings in the text. But you'll see this is really early for this phenomenon, early 13th century. And now comes one of the most fascinating pieces in all of this. This is something that literally took me about 40 years to understand, and I think I've almost got it. I'll put the foundation pieces in. Shir HaShirim says, Domeh Dodi Litzvi, my beloved is like a gazelle. That's all we have to read about the pasuk. The beloved is God. The gazelle disappears very regularly when it goes out to forage for food or tend to its friends, etc. Now the Zohar does four things in a very complicated text that I'll show you. The first thing we understand is that the Zohar identifies the Shekhinah with the nun that's missing in Ashrei. Why? Because just as the Shekhinah sometimes disappears from Bnei Yisrael, the nun of Ashrei has disappeared, and we long for it, like we long for the Shekhinah. Foundation piece one. Number two, this I think is phenomenal. The Zohar says that the markings illustrate, and I use that term advisedly and point to it and shout it out. The Torah includes illustrations of the posture of the Shekhinah facing or turning away from Bnei Yisrael on the sojourn in the desert. The Shekhinah resides on top of the Aron Kodesh, which traverses the desert in several days in front of Bnei Yisrael and looks back at the people longingly, and the nuns reversed or backwards note that. There's an interpretive disagreement in the Zohar between Shimon Bar Yochai and his son Eliezer, and that discussion leads to us seeing the argument they're having about what should the inverted nuns in the Torah look like, and their evidence is designs for the nun markings that they saw in each of their grandfathers' separate personal Torah scrolls. So that's a long-winded story. It's all embedded in the text of the Zohar. And right here is the heart of that argument. So, the second line, due to the love of Israel, it turned its face towards them. That's the Shekhinah, turning away from the ark like a gazelle, who, when going, turns its face back to the place it has left. The gazelle looks backward from whence it came. So as the ark journeyed, the nun turned its face toward Israel and its shoulders toward the ark. This is very complicated to read in Zoharic Aramaic because all the pronouns refer one to another in this big ball of knots. And then in the latter part, it says, do not abandon us. Turn your face towards us. That's a quote. The nun turned back toward them. And then it says that there's a picture in the text, which isn't really there, like someone turning his face toward his beloved. And when the ark in Israel began to rest, the nun turned its face from Israel and turned back toward the ark, turning completely. Very complicated. I'm not sure anyone really understands it. But this is what they're talking about. How do we write the Nun marking? Should it be like the left-hand gazelle looking forward, or should it be like the right-hand gazelle looking backward? Now, I don't know where the chicken and the egg is here, whether the design was modeled on the gazelles, it does say Domed, Dozi, Litzvi, or whether the shape of the gazelles was seen as being related to the markings. But this is how the Zohar envisions this mystical idea and tells us that the markings in the Torah are illustrations. In the Cairo Geniza, which can be dated, let's say, 11th century, it includes material much older, we find markings shaped as circled there, which very much resemble the markings that I think are like the gazelle. That means that this was a popular marking back then. Clearly, by the time the Zohar was hit the stands, the newsstands in the late 13th century, this was a known marking, and one of the Torahs of the Bar Yochai boys, grandfathers, had a lun that looked like that in it. But at the same time in the Cairo Geniza, you find a much more standard shaped nun like you're seeing here in a Cairo Geniza working Bible. Most interestingly, Maimonides, probably the greatest Jewish legal scholar and certainly the greatest codifier, makes absolutely no mention of these markings in Sefer Bamidbar. Nothing, not even an oblique reference. There are many theories about this. It's been an enigma forever. It's possible that he didn't know about them, but I think that's silly because all Sifrei Torah, as far as I can tell, to his date, had inverted nuns in them. Maybe he didn't think they should be there. A possibility, the Rambam leaves out things that he thinks should fall by the wayside from our tradition. Much of that is documented. Maybe he thought that these were extraneous, that's a theory, and they shouldn't be there, that they made a Torah puzzle. Maybe he includes them when he makes a reference to special letters in general in the Yad HaChazaka. But it's not clear because he mentions other kinds of letters which aren't in our Sefer Torah generally, but doesn't mention the inverted nuns. And this is a likely possibility that he had already given approval to the Aleppo Codex as the perfect document, the perfect Tanakh. They were in there, we think, because they're in the Psalm 107. We assume they were in Numbers 10. So perhaps he was just saying the perfect text with all the appropriate letters is visible in, including the inverted nuns, in the Aleppo Codex. One day I hope we'll find out. But the Rambam does not mention these, and that's just a fascinating quirk in itself. This is the oldest Sefer Torah that we know about. It was discovered misfiled in a library in Bologna, Italy, several years ago. And it looks like this. Notice it doesn't have crowns and jots and tittles on the letters, except for here the Samach of Bin Soa, which is obviously some scribal tradition. The Nunim are pretty standard for what we've seen to date, and they're in the text before and after, not really as brackets, but almost as space fillers. Now, we get to the late 13th century. You'll notice that the 13th and 14th century appear a lot. Here we have a phenomenon that I thought didn't happen until the 16th century, but obviously research proved otherwise. You'll notice that in these three documents, only the center document is a Sefer Torah. The other two are rabbinic Bibles. They include Masoretic information, but you can see that the scribe has introduced Z-shaped characters in the left-hand one into the text of the Torah. That's a radical move. Again, I emphasize this was not done lightly. It was done to fulfill what he and his rabbinic supervisor and the editor of the text believed was the appropriate Masoretic thing to do. Here it's in a Sefer Torah in two places again, in the Bin Soa and in Uvnucho. but not in Kemit Onanim in that text. And here you have a different symbol inserted in the same places, much more like the symbol we've been seeing today. So it appears that the 13th century was really a hotbed of discussion about what these markings should look like. And of course, by this time, the Zohar is having an influence on the text. We have no idea who started this tradition or who it was approved by, but it didn't happen by accident.
Sholom, those seem to be Sholom. Those seem to be replacing our own, like what we understand as the inverted nuns. In other words, I don't see the nuns bracketing the text. I see them inside the text. So this is a replacement. Yeah.
You're right. That's exactly what you're seeing. They felt that this is the appropriate place for what the Mishnah and the Gemara referred to, or what the Gemara refers to as the Nunin Hafuchim. This is their interpretation of Rashi's before and after, and there's huge amounts of halachic literature trying to justify this. I'm just working on some of that now, but it takes a few hundred years till people realize they need a halachic justification for this, and it develops. But this seems just to have been a tradition that developed, moving them inside the text. It becomes more complicated. This is, for comparison's sake, scrolls from around Europe around the same time, and you'll see it's a whole range of things. On the bottom right, we have a dotted marking from Persia. It's very Z-shaped. You see sort of Z shapes developing in the other one. The top left-hand one is a very important text we'll see later that was used more recently for important purposes. And there you see two different markings. Again, on the top left from Parma, Italy, there's a certain amount of inconsistent calligraphy in those markings, but they generally look the same. And you'll see similar markings from Spain down below. So the 13th century is really a hotbed. Here's some more from the 13th century. These are both intralinear targumim. So there's a Hebrew text followed by a Judeo-Arabic text or an Aramaic text. In these Bibles, they're not Torah scrolls, but you can see that the one on the left is bracketed, preceded and followed by an inverted nun shape, and the one on the right has a bit of a Z shape at the top and your standard bracket on the bottom. The two markings in the middle of the right-hand text are placeholders. They're not inverted nuns. They sometimes look like inverted nuns. They didn't want to leave the space empty at the end of these lines, and there wasn't enough room to put in the next line or the next word, so they put in a filler. You see that a lot in medieval manuscripts. Now, here are some other wild and wacky locations for the inverted nuns. The left-handed document is I conflated those two, I glued them together. It's the bottom of one column and the top of another column, but you'll notice that both of the inverted nun markings, Z-shaped, are in the middle of the text. Sorry, that's not true. They're not. They're at the beginning, at the end, but they're broken up by the line, and they are Z-shaped. On the other side of the page is not a document from not much different in time, where similarly Germanic, it shows that the markings are both collected together as a pair at the end of the text. There's nothing at the beginning of the text. So again, a different interpretation of the tradition. No more information about these. Sometimes these documents come with nothing more than a date or a place. Not to think that there isn't a full range of possibilities in the 13th century. Here you see three scrolls. These are two scrolls on the right and a book on the left, where there is no inverted nun whatsoever. So we've gone full circle from before and after to inside the text to not appearing at all. So apparently there were scrolls that were considered kosher that held that there should not be any markings there at all, and we'll see rabbinic opinions about that as we move forward. Here is I think a tale of 500 years that really speaks to the desire to preserve traditions. On the left-hand side is one of the documents we've seen earlier from the Geniza a 10th or 11th century, with a backwards nun shaped marking with a little bit of a horn. 300 years later, you have this document, which is almost chosen at random. I could have chosen others that show the same thing, but you see a very, very similarly shaped nun, backwards nun. And in 1546, Daniel Bomberg, who we'll hear more about later, he's the preeminent Jewish printer in Venice in the 16th century, he publishes a text called Pesikta Zutarta, kind of an esoteric midrash text, and in it are the same markings. I'm pointing out that for over 500 years, this tradition of this shape marking remained solid with the same text. This is the text from Pesikta Zutarta on the left-hand side from the Cairo Geniza, and this is the same text on the right-hand side from Bomberg's press in the middle of the 16th century. A very strong tradition that's important. And here you have, just for completeness sake, a random selection of 13th and 14th century designs that show a range of shapes. Some of them have an elongated bottom foot. Some of them are more Z-shaped or angular than others. Some of them are more curvilinear. The third one on the second row is Z-shaped, as is the fifth one, where there's a dot on it. It's really, really a dog's breakfast, and all of these were considered appropriate, and if they were Sifrei Torah, there was no choice but to use them. And here, one of my favorites, artistic license and scribal creativity led to these backward nun-shaped markings in a 14th century French Bible. And the scribe was obviously being very playful in making the nun into an arm shape with little fingers on the end. It's quite astounding. The manuscript itself is beautiful. There's all kinds of pretty things in it, but I didn't discover anything nearly as earth-shattering as this. Now we get to the 15th century, where we see a larger range, a broader range in markings. You'll see on the top left very much a Z-shaped marking. And in the Judeo-Persian document in the middle, a very stylized marking on the left, much more curvilinear, and a pretty standard square, long-footed marking on the right. Pretty standard stuff on the right-hand top column. The bottom left is one of the early examples of an inverted and backwards nun. We'll see many more of those soon. The 15th century Spanish document in the bottom middle has interesting crowns on top, and it's a shape that is really unique, and I think it speaks to the artistic license, but it's a crowned marking, which is kind of rare. And on the bottom right, again, we saw a few minutes ago, two markings paired up at the end of the text. There it is again, and that's in the middle of the text. And the first nun of Bin Soa is reversed. This is a strange configuration. It's quite unique. But it shows you that through the 15th century, things are very much in flux. Here's another example of that kind of flux.
Sholom, sorry to interrupt. Sholom, sorry.
Yeah, sure.
It should be noted that normally when a Sofer does a nun, it does have a crown.
That's true.
The three lines coming up in that 15th century Spain. So that's a normal thing for a nun, where we haven't seen that before. That kind of messes up the theory that they're nunim. Because
why?
Well, a nun should have the crown, right? I mean, like
so one of the questions discussed by the medieval halachic authorities is whether these are letters or symbols, random symbols, and the tradition changed. Some scrolls have no crowns, jots and tittles whatsoever. You'll notice that the one we're talking about there, the bottom middle one, the letters of the text have no crowns. Only the
Yeah.
nun in there has the
That's
crowns.
crazy. Yeah, that's interesting.
So that's what's interesting. In this one, we see a very similar scroll. These all seem to be around the 15th century as well. But on the left scroll, you see inverted reversed nun, and on the right side, you see just a reversed nun. No, nobody knows why. These are traditions that developed. And here you have something that, from my earliest days doing this research, I said would be, so to speak, part of the expression, the Holy Grail. Will I ever find a scroll where every possible nun is treated somehow? And here you see it. The nun before and the nun after, the nun of Binsoa, the nun of Uvnucho with a crown on it, and an inverted nun in Kemit Onanim. There's still a nun in Misanecha that nobody ever played with, that I've ever found, and the Vayanusu nun has a crown on it, but is not treated as a nun. You'll see this more pronounced later, but it seems that everybody had an opinion and was able to get it implemented into a Sefer Torah. So, an overview of this 100 years that I'm calling the 16th century. What a century. This is when you sit back and think what was going on here over 100 years. Gutenberg, who invented the European printing press in the late, halfway through sort of the 15th century, is the anchor point. The press hits the world and books start to be published immediately. And there were lots of Jewish books published immediately. The Jews are expelled from Spain in 1492. That brings them to all kinds of new places. Daniel Bomberg, a non-Jewish wealthy entrepreneur, invests a tremendous amount of money in publishing Hebrew books by the thousands, and he dies 1549. While he's alive, Solomon Luria, who we'll look at in a few minutes, writes some major halachic works. The Maharshal, Solomon Luria, was the preeminent halachic authority in Europe at the beginning of the 16th century and well through it. His rival and friend, fellow student, was the Maharam, mayor of Lublin. He died in 1616. They were both students of Moses Isserlis, the famous Ramah, who wrote the glosses on Yosef Karo's Shulchan Aruch. So in this 100 years, there are giants of halacha dealing with some of the issues of the inverted nuns while the printing press is warming up. The printing press and the inverted nuns are a big issue because just what are you supposed to put on the paper that comes out of the press to make the appropriate kosher Bible? So we're going to look at 4 individuals who lived at this period of time who are major players in the history of the text of the Torah. 2 halachists, Solomon Luria and Meir ben Gedalia, the Maharam of Lublin, and 2 Italian Masoretic scholars, Menachem de Lanzano and Yedidia Norzi, who are the pinnacle of halachic literature. They were both born in Italy. They were buddies. They spent a lot of time in the Middle East looking for documents together and writing with each other's works in mind. And it's really quite interesting that we have a window into this. Just for background, I'm not dealing with any of these documents about the inverted nuns through from the 11th to the 18th century, even though each one of them is significant to my story, especially the last one from the 18th century. But these are things that I'll deal with sometime in the future. They're all very interesting. They're much more drasha-oriented and mystically oriented, and they're all written by important personalities of these years. We start with the Maharshal, Solomon Luria. He wrote 2 works. The first one we're looking at here is Chochmat Shlomo. It's a smaller halachic work. And he has the audacity to say here that in corrected texts, that means a scroll or a document that was worked on by scholars to improve its quality and its accuracy, he did not see the diacritical marks, the inverted nuns. Now, that statement is astounding in itself when we read on. It seems to me that they are invalid according to what becomes invalidated by even one extraneous or lacking letter. He's saying the markings, if they appear, make a Sefer Torah pasul, which means that if you go according to his psak, every Sefer Torah that any gentleman that I know of, that anyone's ever had an aliyah on in the modern world, was done over a pasul Sefer Torah. Now, I have not yet discovered any reaction to this hugely powerful earthquake statement, but it doesn't last very long because he changes his mind for a whole bunch of reasons and doesn't stand by that opinion within a few years. In the Yam Shel Shlomo, a massive work that we don't have all of, but we've got a good chunk of it on the Bavli, he says that it's also surprising to find these markings in there since an inverted letter is not a letter. It's true. If you invert an L, it's not an L. And there is no greater way to change a letter than this. So he's saying that the markings are not letters, and therefore maybe they don't make the Sefer Torah pasul when they're before and after the text. And he makes an interesting comment here at the bottom. If so, since the scribe accepted the tradition to invert the letters, we should, milachatchila ab initio, invert them and certainly not nullify them. He completely changes his opinion. He says if you find a Sefer Torah where there are these inverted nuns, then the scribe put them in there on his own recognizance, which the Rambam allows in Hilchot Sifrei Torah, and we shouldn't call that Sefer Torah with the extraneous nuns pasul. It would be kosher for use. So already you see the halakhic turmoil that's going on here, and much of this is happening, I believe, because the printing press's editors, the people who are deciding what's going to actually go onto the press, are having this discussion about what do you do about these nuns. They've seen many, many different versions, and they have to come to an opinion. He eventually says that there's been a mistake here in our tradition, but we can't do anything about it. He uses this Talmudic phrase, kevan al. Once an error occurs, it's impossible to eradicate it because that's what he's seeing. And he gives an opinion here. Interestingly, while he's writing about the inverted nuns, he makes an aside and he says during his research, he discovered the Zohar, meaning it was the first time he learned Zohar. And he found something valuable for this discussion in the Zohar. And he says, all of a sudden, never having heard of the Zohar before, that the truth is in the Zohar, and he's going to bring the proper design and location of the markings based on the Zohar. And he says that the reason he's holding by this new opinion in the Zohar is because the Zohar has been around since the days of Shimon Bar Yochai, which is the tale told about the Zohar. He says in the middle of the discussion, and after that I studied the Zohar, which is the source. Now, I've never made a decision about what he means by which is the source, shemimeno yavo hamakor. It's likely that he means the source of the problem of the inverted nuns. It's also possible he means this is the source of this Torah. He says this is a completely different issue that is not at all dependent on the markings, but is closer to the pshat of the text. From it, we understand that even in the days of the Tanaim, there was a tradition amongst them regarding the inversion of the nuns, but a doubt arose among the texts. And that's why you see many different versions of the marking. So he's saying, we really don't have an accurate text, and I don't know what to do with these markings. And he was a scientist. And he says he went out and collected in his neighborhood, which let's say 12 miles around his house. He found these 12 different versions of the implementations of the markings. And he describes them. And an author in the early 20th century transcribed his descriptions into this typeset text. And you see here 12 permutations and combinations of where inverted nun markings might appear in scrolls and books of the 16th century. The one that's most interesting is the one on the bottom, the 12th, where there's an inverted nun above every nun that he could find in the text. Pretty astounding. And what does a halachist do with this when he's got to decide what a kosher Sefer Torah is? Maharshal lists how to fix each of these or how to remove them from circulation. In essence, at the bottom, the real fundamental thing that the Maharshal says, that we've all got it wrong, and these markings aren't actually physical markings in his opinion. In his discussion, he says that they were the markings that are referred to in the literature are the spaces before and after the text, which leave the text standing on its own, seemingly like an independent book of the Bible. But he says that God knows the symbols, the parshiot, ptuchot and stumot, to be those symbols. No one else ever says that, but others base their discussion on things like that the Maharshal said. Now, here is a watershed, a major issue. When Bomberg published the first Mikraot Gedolot-like Bible, 1524, this is why Mikraot Gedolot look the way they do. He inserted the nun into the text, as you see on the right-hand side. The nun of Bin Soa and the nun of Kemit Onanim, like we saw in earlier scrolls, was inserted into the text. His editor was a very learned man, someone who knew what he was doing in editing this text, and for one reason or another, he chose to use this less than normative, rather esoteric tradition to include the markings in these locations. No one had ever done this before in print, because print wasn't a thing yet, but this was radical for this to be made official by the thousands in this very important document. However, we know already, we've seen, and we see more here, nuns reversed or inverted inside the text is not something unique to the Bomberg 1524 edition. The scroll on the bottom left, which is enlarged on the bottom right, I have no information about its location or date, but it's an example of the inverted nun being stylized with curly cues. The Rambam talks about letters with curly cues and whirligigs on them. And here you see inverted, reversed nuns with curly cues on them, embedded in the text of the Sefer Torah. Over the years that the Bomberg was publishing texts, his design for the nuns changed, and you can see them here. In 1517, he was printing the first Bible from his press, and they looked very much like just inverted, reversed nuns. Similarly, in 1546, we saw the 1524 earlier, where the editor has changed where the inverted nuns go. Torah Hashem Tamima is another edition of, it's a copy, a reprint of a Bomberg Bible from a Bomberg press. And again, we saw the 1546 Psikta Zutrata, where another design, similar but different, it's not inverted, it's just reversed, design is implemented. So they're all over the place from the same publishing house. And now, in the later part of the 16th century, another great scholar, the Maharam of Lublin, takes issue with many of the things the Maharshal said. And he says, it's apparent that the Midrashim and the interpretations which I referred to earlier in his essay do not agree with Luria's statements, and therefore one shouldn't nullify a Torah in which these inverted nuns are written because there's some authority for this. So this was probably written before Maharshal retracted his original statement that they make a Sefer Torah puzzle. But notice what he says here. He says, the inverted nuns are okay to be there. One shouldn't nullify a Torah scroll in which they're there because there's some authority for this. Yeah, there's already about 1,500 years of normative rabbinic tradition for this authority, but that doesn't seem to be the issue here. So he says he doesn't have an authority to nullify a scroll which doesn't have the inverted nuns in them, since there are midrashim that divide the issue about what these symbols look like. We don't know exactly what he's referring to. The Sifrei says they're only dots, if you understand nakudalav meaning dotted. So it would appear that it would be sufficient to have any recognizable symbol used, as long as they're distinguished from the section before, like brackets, and after it. As Luria wrote, and Luria did say this, why do I need these markings or dots or spaces? What's their point? He gave up. The Maharam says something astounding here, that the nuns of Bin Soa, according to all, must be inverted. According to all, de kula alma, he's saying that his halachic decision is that every Sefer Torah, according to every scribe and authority, has an inverted nun in the word Bin Soa. And a scroll in which there are inverted nuns in Bin Soa, and in Uvnucho and in Kamit Onanim, if they're all inverted, it should not be nullified because it's written according to the interpretation of the Psikta and the Zohar. I never understood where he gets this in the Psikta or the Zohar. I take his word for it. But you'll notice the crowned nun there, and all of the nuns, as I showed before, are included in this document that he says is the proper one. So he says that the nun of Bin Soa should be inverted totally, its head turned below, and he puts a picture in. I don't have a picture of that. But the nun of Uvnocha is inverted from front to back. So here he's distinguishing between merely upside down and right to back, and front to back. That doesn't happen in very many descriptions, and it's handy for him to use that, and it shows his description of his understanding of the Zohar. And here you see two scrolls with inverted and reversed markings. It never stays the same. Now we come to a fascinating character we don't know very much about. Menachem de Lanzano, as I said earlier, was an Italian who ended up in Jerusalem and elsewhere in the Middle East, looking for manuscripts, Sifrei Torah, that would enable him to compile a proper, final Masoretic notes on everything in Tanakh. And he did an amazing job doing exactly that. But he takes Bomberg to task. It's 100 years after Bomberg published the 1524 Bible, and he says there are errors in the large and small Bibles, that's the 1517 and 1524 editions. He said not only did he reverse the marking, turning it backwards, he also inverted it top to bottom, placing the head of the nun at the bottom and the foot above. He says, this never occurred to anybody to do, and it's wrong. So all those Sifrei Torah that we saw written with inverted nuns and inverted reverse nuns, this master of this literature says they're all possible. But he does something else that is fascinating and could only happen in the middle of the 15th century. He blames the technology for Bomberg's problem. He says, I know it would be difficult in the world of printing to make a backwards nun, as it should be without initial preparation. I think he means spending money on making another letter to use, since this requires great effort, whereas the poured, which meaning the stuff that his engineers made out of lead to set the type of the Bible, the prepared stuff and available nuns cannot be reversed face backwards without inverting the head to the bottom and the foot to the top. I'll explain what that means in a minute. Thus, the viewer, that's the Koreh, the reader of the scroll, which includes the mistake he's referring to, doesn't know that it's the art of printing which caused this error. Since not everyone is knowledgeable about printing, and the reader thinks that this was done intentionally and that it should be this way. He's saying when you open a book and you see something printed there, you don't know if it's there for good reason or bad reason. And what he's saying is that what he did here with what de Lanzano was saying Bomberg did, he cheaped out and he didn't make new letters, which would enable the engineers to take the piece of type with the proper inverted nun and insert it in the block of type properly so it would look right. In other words, blaming the technology for the letter that looks out of place. Now, the problem with this theory is that if you look at Bomberg's Bible, on the bottom left, you'll see that he does use a different nun character. They didn't just flip over the nun that is in Min HaMachaneh and use it for Bin Soa. So either I don't have enough information about what de Lanzano was actually looking at, or I don't understand why he's saying this, because his excuse that the technology caused this problem doesn't ring 100% true. He also has many other issues with Bomberg. De Lanzano ends up saying that he would actually like to see this design as described in the Zohar, like a gazelle who when going turns its face to the place that it has left. He likes this design because of the Zohar. But he says at the bottom, since he hasn't found a design like this in any scroll, even though it's minadin, logically correct, he cancels his opinion and withdraws his statement, even though we know there are Sifrei Torah that preceded him with markings like that. A third error that de Lanzano finds in the Bomberg Bibles is that the marks are inverted top to bottom, and he says this has never crossed anyone's mind. It's not correct to do this, specifically after we were informed in the Zohar that the intent of these backward nuns is to hint about the Shekhinah, who was symbolically represented in the letter Nun, and we know why. It is certainly not respectful to heaven to invert the head downward and the foot above. Please note that it's only 200 or so years since the Zohar appeared on the newsstands, and its influence is astounding. It goes from nothing to influencing the actual writing of the Sefer Torah, and according to some scholars, it illustrates the position of the Shekhinah as we traveled through the desert. We come now to the final halachic authority. If you have a good Mikraot Gedolot, you will find the commentary of Minchat Shai in the back. It's not the complete commentary. There are several versions from different manuscripts, but it's a popular back of the book commentary because it's the final word on the Masoretic accuracy of the Sefer Torah. So Minchat Shai, who was a friend of de Lanzano's, and they worked together and shared information, he says the printers have made varied mistakes, and there is a very well-known mistake, ta'ut ze mefursam. There are those who place the marking before Vayibin Sola Aaron, and after it they put a nun that's larger than the rest of the letters and inverted the head of the nun downward and its foot upward. That's something we saw in the Bomberg books. It's not proper to do this. And the Ralbag, Levi ben Gershom, another commentator who's in the Mikraot Gedolot, he wrote, I don't know what these dots or markings are. Whether it's dots or markings, I think he means markings, nukudot, in that sin. I have not yet found the Ralbag where it actually says that. And here I had the zechut last winter to find the actual manuscripts of Minchat Shai to see what his pen put into the manuscript as the appropriate markings. Minchat Shai is an interesting story. He wrote this manuscript, I'll show you a picture of it in a minute, and it was not published for over 100 years, till well into the 18th century. So it's really actually sort of unknown to the general rabbinic public and is not considered one of the classic commentaries, but it's important enough to have in the Mikraot Gedolot. And he tells us that in a few scrolls, the whole nun is reversed backwards, and that's from one of the manuscripts we saw, and I'll show you again. And it's found like this in the Psikta of Rav Tuvia. We saw that both in a Dead Sea Scroll version and in a Bomberg press version, and similarly shows the language of the Zohar, again capitulating to the design mentioned in the Zohar for that marking. But in most scrolls of Sfarad, The scholars consider the scrolls of Sfarad, Sifrei Sfarad, as different and often better. They leave the face of the nun as is, reversing the foot. And that's what's shown in the manuscripts of Minchat Shai. It's the same size as the rest of the letters of scrolls, and he says it's the design of the medieval Parshan, Bible interpreter, the Rekanati. He says it's like a man prostrate on his knees before the king asking for his needs, and that's what this would look like. We have scrolls with those kinds of nuns in it. And he finally says at the end that it really should be the backwards nun that we saw in Cairo Geniza scrolls and the Pesikta scroll that was preserved over those years. This is the manuscript of Minchat Shai. There are two of them, and they have different pieces in them. If you try to read this, you won't get very far. It takes a very long time to figure out how to read this, because it's written in sort of almost a graphical code. But if you will, you'll notice at the bottom, the last line is where he says, Ka'adam hakorea al birkav, like a man who's kneeling on his knees. Lifnei, what's he say? Milifnei hamelech umevakesh mimeno tzrachav. So it's hard to read this, but it's these original designs of the markings that this Masoretic genius thought were the appropriate markings. It's important to show that. This is the manuscript that Nortzi thought was the best one he could find. And to add a cherry to the top of this evolutionary process, here you see it actually in action. From this manuscript, this text was published over 100 years later. And you'll see that in the text there are these inverted nun markings, but there's also notes here on the side which provide a different design. And then there's a third design over here with another note that someone wrote in here that it's inverted with a question mark and an exclamation mark. We don't know who did this. This is from that early printing. And it shows you that you never know what the source of the change here is, because you don't know where it's coming from. It could be the rabbi, it could be the scribe, it could be the scribe's yeshiva, the scribe's teacher. It could be an enterprising individual who saw something somewhere else and wrote it into this manuscript, and now it's preserved for us forever. That's what that looks like enlarged. You'd never know what to do here or what to expect in an actual Sefer Torah. Here are 7 Sifrei Torah that at this moment reside in the Heichal of Shearith Israel congregation in Nashville, Tennessee. And you'll see what happens in a modern congregation. All of these scrolls are in very good condition. Most of them look very modern, but you'll see I think no two of them are the same. And if you look through, you'll see designs we've seen elsewhere. They're all outside the text in the space before and after, and they show the range that a modern scribe has in making the inverted nuns in numbers. And here, a treasure. This is Vayhi ben Soah Ha'aron from the Kaifeng Sefer Torah. It's said to be 17th century-ish. No crowns, no jots and tittles, no inverted nun markings. And it looks very Chinese script-like. From the local neighborhood here, literally within walking distance of where I am, there are these 3 Sifrei Torah. Not much of a provenance on them, but they again show a range and some interesting anomalies. Each one of these has, each different scroll has at least one nun marking with a crown on it. Some of them are inverted and reversed. Here's crowns above and below for sort of mirror images of the same marking. Here's one with a Z with one without a Z, and the Z is in a different place on the bottom, top and bottom. That's the range we have right in the neighborhood. These are the facsimile markings that I worked with for the first 30 or so years. These are found in Menachem Kasher's Torah Shlema, an amazing work of 47 volumes on the Torah that has all kinds of information, including much information I use on the inverted nuns. But he took a pen and made similar markings that are confusing in some cases. Here you see on the bottom left the fishhook markings that I mentioned in my first presentation. And you see that the man beseeching God for his needs in both different directions like the Zohar. And here's the one with the curly Q on it. So these were a mystery to me until I went into the manuscripts. Somehow or other, throughout the 20th century, Kasher got his own access to these manuscripts that are all over the world and was able to make these drawings for us that kept pushing me to find more and more. And here is the one thing that needs its own piece of research. This is from an unknown text, very rarely referred to. We have one copy of this that came to us through India somehow. It purports to be a Geniza document. It has a copy in it of Ashrei with including a pasuk for the Nun. So we know there's a copy from the Dead Sea Scrolls with a Nun verse, and Chazal conjecture what the Nun verse is. But here you have an Ashrei from a Jewish source that has a pasuk that reads, Naflu kol oivecha Hashem v'chol giborehem baltu or kaltu. Both of them sort of make sense. But the nun of this extra verse is reversed. And I think that shows that the scribe knew that if you want to point out something special about a verse that's out of place, transposed, misplaced, this is how you would do it. And he added that into that. And that's something that is yet to be written about. So with that, I will call it quits and unshare the screen and open us up to questions, because there may be one or two. Any questions? Hello? Am I hearing you? Gita, unmute.
I wouldn't deign to question you about all the research you did and the billion variations and combination permutations. What I'm just curious about is how the heck you could get, I mean, you're not that old a person. How could you live long enough to get all these variants, like from many, did you travel? I mean, how did you
COVID was very, very good for my research. After I found the first manuscript, and I don't know what it was, it became easier and easier and easier to find the next ones. Uh-huh. They're not in that many places. The Bodleian, the British Museum, the British Library, the Vatican, Hebrew University has a database that points you directly to the manuscript. One thing led to another. The trick was actually opening up the manuscript, and they're huge. The documents are huge. They're multi-megabytes, any one of them, and leafing through until I found the right spot. I had to learn how to recognize parts of the Torah that I don't know off by heart. So the trick was to find Birkat Kohanim and then move from there. It often took at least 10 minutes, sometimes a half an hour, to find the actual piece of the scroll I was looking for. And then I made some pictures and put them in the databases and annotated them and went on to the next one. And in some places like the British Library, there are dozens. And the Vatican has, I don't know what the number is, easily hundreds of copies of the Pentateuch, labeled Hebrew Bible, Pentateuch. So you look for ones that from the outside look like a scroll, or they're described as a scroll, and then you download it, pop it open, and do the work. It takes
very easy, very easy.
It was fun because I knew there was always something around the corner, and I was right. There were things that would pop out that blew my mind, that I thought would be there, that I thought I could find, and there they were.
Okay, thank you.
Sholom?
Yeah.
What's the state of the current scholarship on this topic? Is there anybody that has written about it other than you?
Yeah, not things that are what I've done. If you think about it, and my mentor Barry Levy says there is no work like this, and you think about it simply because what other pasuk of the Torah can you do this on? Now, to be fair, it's a standard exercise in the history of Parshanut to take a pasuk and write the history of the interpretation of the pasuk. I did that with the Hanephilim Hayu Ba'aretz. That's amazing when you find 150 interpretations of a verse and you watch it grow and evolve over the decades. This is different because it's not textual and it's a marking, it's a symbol for something. So part of the discussion is what is this for and how easily fixed is it, because it's not part of the fixed text. Many of the halachas say you're not messing with the Torah when you're messing with the inverted nun, even if they're in the text. So there was just all this leeway, and it blossomed, and not everybody ever had access to all the stuff that I have access to. So this kind of work either, well, certainly hasn't been done on many psukim, and it's a question about whether it can be done. You could do a research essay on the big bait at the beginning of Sefer Bereshit and look at Sifrei Torah across the generations and see that. But I don't think there's anything. Maybe you could do it with the configuration of Az Yashir or Birkat Kohanim, but nothing has the meat that the inverted nuns have, so I've discovered. There are some questions in the chat, which I will look at now and see where that goes. Okay, so Simcha Mendelssohn says the issue here is the shape and form. That's exactly right. Shape and form is all I was ever really concerned about. Someone said it's hard to know where to start. Fascinating mystery. That's exactly what keeps me going. Just as an aside, I'm working on something now that may take me a year. 4 tshuvas from the 18th century. Lvov, a relatively unknown man that I know nothing about, wrote 4 incredibly detailed halachic tshuvas, which completely turn the whole issue on its head. And he uses a purely halachic argument using rabbinic sources to completely recontextualize the whole foundational understanding of the Gemara that leads to all of this. And he takes him 4 tshuvas back and forth, reaction and response. It's huge, and it really might take me a year because it's very slow going. So there's much more to say about this. I love people who make jokes in the chat. Notes in the margins. Ruvain, notes in the margins are the Masoretic notes. They come in. They're in codices, not in scrolls. They're the manuscripts. They are the system, the notes of system that says this word is spelled this way, these 3 places, and it's different in that place. And that's a system that enables us to keep the Torah spelled correctly and vocalized correctly. It doesn't work all that well over the 2,000 years, but that's what those little markings and notes in the margins are. Any other questions, comments?
Yeah, I have a comment, or actually a question. Can you speak about, you used the word pasul quite a few times relating to these nuns. What about words that have missing letters in them? And at the side of the text, you'll see which letters are missing in a word. Now,
right.
Why is the Sefer Torah considered kosher if we've got missing letters in words?
Great question. You may have noticed in this last week's Parsha Naso. Was that Naso? No. Shlach. Right near the end. I think it was in Shishi. There was the word chatat, and it was chaser aleph. It was missing an aleph. And several weeks ago, not more than 3 or 4, an exactly similar phenomenon. A word is missing, chatat is missing the aleph. Well, the history of the tradition of the text shows that just happens. You have one sefer that has the mistake in it, and it's copied by another sofer, and it proliferates. That's likely how it happens. It's a scribal error, but when it goes into a kosher sefer, the next scribe is very reticent to fix the mistake, and he may not see it. Ultimately, it becomes part of the tradition that it's missing an aleph. The Kriyan Ktiv system is probably just that kind of thing. There were different versions, and Chazal decided to record the different versions, and there you see Vavs that turned into Yuds, Yuds that turns into Vavs, spelling mistakes, words with extra letters, words that are spelled differently, or read and not written. There's lots of different scribal tradition built into just the way a scribe is supposed to write a proper Sefer Torah. Are any two Sifrei Torah the same down to the letter that you're referring to? I don't think so. I don't think they don't all match each other, and it's relatively easy to find two Sifrei Torah with differences in word spellings. I'm not saying that telling tales out of school. That's the fact of the history of our tradition. Does that answer the question?
I suppose it does, but
I'm willing to say it's a spelling mistake as well.
So can one not say similar things about the nuns?
Sure. I think I've demonstrated that scribes and their rabbinic supervisors took liberties with the shape and location of the nuns. That's the story here. That for whatever reason, I actually had a conversation with a scribe about 2 or 3 years ago after COVID started. I found some work of his on the internet, and I phoned him. Lives in Belgium, and he was then working on a Sefer Torah for his own personal use. And we had a long discussion about what design and location he was going to use for the inverted nuns in his new Sefer Torah. It appeared that he had a choice, and he would get it approved. I think he was a Rav himself, but it would be approved because he chose to use it. That's how fluid this is, even to our day. The 7 Sifrei Torah in Nashville sort of demonstrate that scribes have a hand in this, and their rabbi gives them approval, and who's going to contradict the two of them?
Okay, all right.
It's not the story we heard in Hebrew school, so to speak. So with that, if there are no more questions, I don't see anything else in the chat. Oh, wait a minute. Oh, Ruvain asks the question. How do we then comprehend and understand the notion that everything in our Torah comes from Moshe at Har Sinai, I assume? Well, my simple answer is, since we got it at Har Sinai, we've been responsible for preserving it and reproducing it and ensuring that our tradition survives based on it. But it's been in the hands of man since then. And to think that men could preserve it 100% perfectly. Don't get me wrong. The text of the Torah is incredibly well preserved over thousands of years when we compare to Dead Sea Scrolls. Incredible. But there are things that aren't the same. And we have the tradition acknowledges them. This discussion that we're having here about the accuracy of the text and whether we should fix it and change it is on the minds and pens of halachic scholars throughout the generations. There's many volumes that describe the back and forth between major scholars about whether we should correct the Torah based on the Midrash, based on the Zohar? Are the psukim and the Gemara that are different than what we have in the Tanakh to be fixed, or do we fix the Sfarim? All of this is well known. It just doesn't jibe with the notion of the perfect, pristine text, which really doesn't exist.
I have a comment or a question. Simcha Mendelssohn.
Yes.
The issue of the Nun is perfectly documented. I'm amazed. But I have my puzzle here is, how is it decided that that particular pasuk doesn't fit on the text? Where you told us the first time it doesn't fit, fine. But I would like to memorize, I would like to learn, when is it the first time, or who was that has been followed all along?
We have ancient documents, the Gemara mentions them, that they knew this text was either misplaced in the Torah for whatever reason, or it came from somewhere else and was preserved. Those are ancient rabbinic traditions. The first time it was incorporated in the text of the Torah is lost to us. We don't have a text without Vayihi bin Soa ha'aron, but we have the most ancient texts we know of that are Torah-like, where that set of 85 letters is marked with the appropriate editorial marks as being out of place or different, unique, special. And Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says one day they'll put it back in its proper place. So where it happened first, I don't know, but we have lots of evidence that Chazal knew that that's what happened to it. And the story I would write is, there were 85 letters that were Vayihi bin Soa ha'aron in a scroll that had been destroyed, because that's how the Mishnah describes this. And they decided that those 85 letters were from a kosher, holy source, and they had to be preserved. So they sewed them into another text where it seemed logical, and that's what we have here today. We know that that kind of engineering operation to preserve texts was done in the ancient world, because we have the book of Treasar, which is clearly 12 documents sewn into one book that Chazal know as Treasar. So preservation by pasting, by cutting and pasting, is well known. And that could be another possible answer as to how this happened.
I mean, the amazing thing is, when you take the Torah out of their own Kodesh, this is what we all say in unison.
Right. But that's because of the context. That's because of what the words mean. That's a good point. But that's a drasha. That's not my historical analysis. And we always distinguish between the two. But you're right. It's a text that everybody knows, which I think is one of the reasons this is sort of intriguing, because we all sing this so often, and we really don't know its context or the history that I've presented. It's interesting.
Wonderful. Toda rabba. Yasher koach.
My pleasure. Any other questions out there? Okay, you can always email me or drop over and see what else there is to look at. There's more coming. Thanks for watching. See you. Kol Tuv. Have a good Chodesh. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Toda rabba.
Toda rabba.